When my ex-girlfriend's mother called and asked if I still knew how to fix a fence, I should have said no. Not because I couldn't fix it. I could fix the fence. I could fix the gate, the porch step, a leaking hose bib, loose cabinet hinges, and roughly half of everything that people ignore until it becomes expensive. What I couldn't fix was the particular sensation that moved through my chest when I saw her name on my phone after 9 months of silence. Margaret Holt, my ex's mother. The woman who had refilled my coffee without asking, who had remembered that I didn't like strong mustard, who had once said to me quietly, while her daughter was upstairs getting ready for a dinner I'd been waiting in the kitchen for, "You know, Owen, some people make a house feel like a house again. You're one of them." I had thought about that sentence more times than I had any reasonable excuse to. My name is Owen Calloway. I was 33 at the time, a restoration contractor running a small crew out of a van and a workshop in the backyard of a rented house in Asheville, North Carolina. I did the kind of work that didn't look impressive on paper, but required more care than most people understood. Stripping paint from Victorian millwork without destroying the profile underneath, replacing rotted sill plates without disturbing the masonry above them, matching a plank floor that hadn't been manufactured since 1952. I was good at it. I was reliably, consistently, quietly good at it. And for 3 years, I had also been reliably, consistently, and quietly good at being with a woman who eventually decided that reliable and quiet were not what she wanted from a life. Her name was Jade. We had been together for 3 years and 2 months, which I know with the precision of a man who spent the months after it ended doing involuntary arithmetic. The relationship ended on a Sunday afternoon in her apartment with 2 half-packed suitcases on the floor. She was heading to a long weekend with friends she'd been drifting toward for over a year, people who moved faster and louder than I did. And a cup of coffee on the counter that had gone cold, and her saying, "I just don't think this is going anywhere, Owen." I remember looking at the shelves I had installed in her dining room, the table I had helped her carry up 2 flights of stairs, the framed print we had argued pleasantly about the placement of for 20 minutes. "Where?" I asked. She exhaled in the way people exhale when a question confirms what they already believed. "Anywhere that isn't this. You're kind, you're dependable, you're good. But everything with you feels so settled, so decided." She said it the way a doctor describes a non-urgent condition. Not cruel, something worse than cruel. Clinical. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I carried my tools from under her sink to my van and drove home with the radio off. And in the weeks that followed, I replicated the same particular silence in the interior of my own life. 5 months later, I heard she had taken a job in Charlotte. 7 months in, a mutual friend mentioned she was seeing someone who described himself as a creative entrepreneur and had 3 different Instagram accounts, each dedicated to a separate facet of his personality. I told myself I hoped she was happy. On the better days, I meant it. So when my phone lit up with Margaret Holt's name on a damp Wednesday morning, I sat with it for long enough that the call almost went to voicemail. Then I answered. "Mrs. Holt." There was a pause, then her voice, careful, warm, the kind of warm that costs something to produce. "Owen, hi. I'm sorry to bother you." "You're not bothering me." It came out too fast. She heard it. Margaret always heard the sentence underneath the sentence. "I wouldn't ask if I had a better option," she said. The storm last night took out part of my back fence. One of the posts pulled free. The gate doesn't latch. I checked the schedule I kept on a clipboard in the van, a habit Jade had once called quaint, the same way she called most of my habits. An inspection pushed to Friday, a cabinet delivery rescheduled for the following week. "I can come by after 4, I said. "Owen, you really don't have to." "I know." Another pause, softer this time. "Thank you." I told myself it was only a fence, a broken fence, a woman who needed help, and a man who knew how to use a post level. Nothing complicated, nothing that should have made me change my shirt twice before driving over. Margaret's house was at the end of a quiet street where people took their lawns seriously and parked their cars at exactly the right angle. I had been there dozens of times over 3 years. Dinners, holidays. A Christmas Eve when Jade had forgotten to tell me the whole family dressed up and I arrived in jeans and work boots. And Margaret had saved me from the silence by saying, loudly enough for the room to hear, "At least someone here looks capable." I had liked her enormously for it, and I had not let myself think about how much I had liked her, because thinking about it clearly would have required admitting something I had no intention of admitting while I was with her daughter. When I pulled into the driveway, the first thing I saw was the fence. One section had pulled away from the post at a roughly 20-degree angle, and the gate listed to one side like something that had simply given up. The second thing I saw was Margaret. She was standing near the back porch in a pale blue shirt and jeans, gardening gloves on her hands, her dark hair pinned loosely at the back of her neck. She was in her late 40s, and she had the quality that some women carry without effort or announcement. A kind of assurance that doesn't ask permission to be present. I got out of the van and immediately resented that I had noticed. "Owen," she said. "Mrs. Holt." Her mouth tilted slightly. "You installed shelves in my dining room and replaced the gutters on my garage. I think we're past that." "Margaret," I corrected. The name felt different in my mouth than it had for the previous 3 years, and I chose not to examine why. She led me around the side of the house and I followed, pulling my tool bag from the van. The yard smelled of wet cedar and cut grass. Wind chimes moved quietly near the porch. 2 coffee mugs sat on the small outdoor table, though only one had been used. She showed me the damage and I crouched beside the pulled post, running my fingers along the base where the wood met the soil. "You tried to brace it," I said. She had wedged a piece of lumber against the post at an angle. "It helped a little," she said. "More than a little." I looked up at her. "Don't be surprised." "I'm not surprised," I said. "I'm impressed." She folded her arms, the garden gloves still on, and something in the air settled briefly into ease, the way air does when 2 people have spent enough time in the same rooms to stop performing for each other. That was the problem with Margaret, and it had always been the problem with Margaret. She didn't make you feel like the room was a test. With Jade, I had spent 3 years quietly trying to be more interesting, more ambitious, more spontaneous, less predictable, less careful, less myself. With Margaret, the quiet had always simply been quiet. I had noticed this and filed it away in the category of things I was not going to think about, and I had done a competent job of it for 3 years. And then she called about a fence and the filing system failed. I worked for the better part of an hour while she moved through the garden nearby, pulling up storm debris, gathering broken stems into a basket. Every so often, she brought me something I hadn't asked for. A clean rag, a glass of water, a longer extension cord from the garage. Not hovering, not making ceremony of it, just noticing and providing, the way people do when they pay genuine attention. At some point, I became aware that she was watching me work, and when I glanced over, she looked away, and I looked back at the gate latch and pretended I hadn't seen the faint color that had moved across her face. It was the decent thing to do. Or possibly it was cowardice. Those 2 things can be difficult to distinguish. "Are you doing all right?" she asked at one point, her voice even. "Mostly." I kept my eyes on the hinge. "That means no." "It means mostly." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I heard Jade is in Charlotte." "Yeah." "How is she?" The question was genuine, I knew, and also careful. Margaret navigating the exact distance between concern for her daughter and honesty about the situation. "She's Jade," I said, which seemed to say enough. Something moved across Margaret's face. "She's chasing what she thinks she wants," she said. "Which is?" Her eyes returned to mine, steady. Something that never asks her to sit still long enough to know herself. There it was, that thing Margaret did. The way she could say something tender and devastating in the same breath, in the same quiet register, as if she had considered the words long before she released them. I looked back at the gate. It was latching better, but the mechanism still needed adjustment. I told myself I had another 20 minutes of work, maybe 30 if I was careful. I noticed, in no particular hurry. "Finish the fence," she said from the porch, pulling off her gloves, "and I'll make dinner." I went still with one hand on the latch hardware. Not because the offer was inappropriate. It wasn't. It was practical and warm and almost innocent. But something in the way she said it, precise and quiet without being either flirtatious or deliberately neutral, warmed the yard in a way that had nothing to do with the late afternoon sun. As if she was offering more than food. As if she was asking me to stay a little longer, and both of us knew it. I turned to look at her. She held my gaze for half a second longer than she needed to, then looked at the gloves in her hand. "You don't have to," she added. There it was, the line that decent people append after saying something they may have meant too much. I should have said I had other work to get back to. I should have packed up after the latch was set and driven away with the radio on. Instead, I looked at the crooked gate, and then I looked at her, and I said, "I can finish it." Margaret nodded, and the small smile she tried not to let fully arrive was the first thing that made me wonder whether the fence had been the only broken thing that brought me here. Dinner was not supposed to feel intimate. It was a sandwich: turkey, sharp cheddar, tomato, toasted bread, with the mustard spread thin on one side because Margaret remembered, without fanfare, without using it to demonstrate anything, that I didn't like it thick. That detail lodged in my chest more firmly than it should have. Jade used to forget small things and then call them small when she was reminded, a strategy that made forgetting less expensive than it was. Margaret remembered them quietly, without constructing a speech from the memory. She didn't say, "I remembered you don't like it thick," the way some people do, loading a small act of attention with the weight of a debt. She simply made the sandwich. The not saying was the whole of it. I washed my hands at the kitchen sink while she moved behind me, opening cabinets, setting plates on the counter, pouring iced tea into 2 glasses. There was a particular choreography to sharing a small kitchen with someone you know well, and the strange thing was how easily I fell back into it. Stepping left when she moved right, not bumping into each other, reading the rhythm of the space the way you do with someone whose habits you've absorbed without studying. I had been in this kitchen many times over 3 years, and my body appeared to remember it better than my brain had admitted. I noticed this and found it unsettling, and said nothing about it. The house looked mostly the same as it had over 3 years of visits. The same yellow curtains over the kitchen window, the same ceramic bowl by the door where everyone dropped their keys, the same old radio on the shelf above the stove, but without Jade's particular energy filling the rooms. Her habit of talking before she'd fully formed the thought, her way of making even quiet evenings feel like they were moving towards something she hadn't decided on yet. The house felt different. Not empty. Honest. Like a place that had always been itself and had simply been waiting for the performance to leave. "You didn't have to do this," I said, sitting down. "I know." "That's becoming your favorite answer." She smiled at the cutting board. "Maybe I learned it from someone." I looked at her. "From me?" "You were always very good at helping people without making them perform gratitude for it." That stopped me. She continued slicing the tomato as if she hadn't said anything particularly precise. I leaned against the counter. Jade called it boring. Margaret's knife paused for exactly 1 beat. Then she continued. "Jade called a lot of things boring before she understood them," she said. She set the knife down carefully, not sharply, and turned to face me. I should have let it go. I didn't. "Did she talk about me?" "After." Margaret looked at me for a moment, the kind of look that is itself an answer before the words come. "Yes," she said. My stomach tightened slightly. I looked toward the back window, where the gate stood straighter now in the late afternoon light, the new screws catching the sun. "What did she say?" Margaret took a slow breath. "She said you were kind, dependable, safe." A small sadness moved through her expression. "She said those words the way she'd say reasons to leave." The words landed the way honest words do when you've been half expecting them for 9 months, not as a surprise, but as a confirmation that makes pretending impossible. She wanted more, I said. Margaret's voice softened. She wanted louder. That phrase moved through me completely, and I had nothing to say in response. She stepped closer to the counter, close enough to reach past me for the glasses, not touching me, not even close to touching me, but close enough that I was aware of the smell of her skin, soap, and something faintly citrus from the cutting board, and the specific gravity of standing near someone who has your complete attention. My mind said, "This is your ex-girlfriend's mother." My body, with its characteristic unhelpfulness, noted that she was a woman standing beside me in a quiet kitchen, and that it had been a long time since a quiet kitchen had felt like anything other than an empty room. I stepped sideways, quickly. Margaret noticed. Of course she noticed. A faint color touched her cheeks. "Sorry," she said. "You didn't do anything." "I know." She looked at the plates. "That's the strange part." We ate at the small kitchen table by the window, not the dining room. The dining room belonged to old family dinners and Christmas, and Jade laughing too loudly at something while I carried plates. The kitchen table was different. Smaller, less formal, more the kind of table where things get said that don't get said at the other kind. We talked around the edges of the real subject for a while, the way people do when they're aware of what the real subject is. The storm, the neighborhood, work. She asked about the renovation I was doing on a craftsman house on the east side, an older place with good bones and badly updated plumbing. And when I described the original woodwork, the way the previous owners had painted over quarter-sawn oak because oak had gone out of fashion for 40 years, her face did something particular. "You've always liked fixing what other people wanted to replace," she said. I smiled faintly. "Sometimes replacing is easier. Easier isn't always better." Neither of us reached for that sentence. Both of us heard it. Then her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it and her expression shifted. Not guilt, not fear, something more complicated. The particular look of a person seeing a name they love and dread in equal measure. "Jade?" I asked. She nodded. "You can answer." "I know." She didn't. It rang out and started again immediately. Margaret picked it up. "Hi, sweetheart." I looked out the window and tried to give her the privacy the kitchen was too small to actually provide. Jade's voice came through the speaker faintly, bright and sharp even at half volume. "Did someone come fix the fence?" Margaret's eyes moved briefly to me. "Owen came." A pause, then Jade's voice shifted register, the particular tone I recognized from the end of things, a laugh that held no warmth. "Mum, seriously? You called Owen?" Margaret's face stilled. "He knew how to fix it." "Of course he did, that's his whole thing." Something tightened in my chest. Jade continued, her voice dropping but remaining audible, the way voices do when they're not quite as careful as they intend to be. "He loves being needed. Just don't let him hang around and get sentimental about it." Margaret closed her eyes. For a moment, I was back in Jade's apartment, listening to her compress 3 years of a relationship into something too small and too neat to hold any of what it actually was. Then Margaret said, very quietly and very precisely, "Jade, that was unkind." A pause on the line. "Oh my God, Mom, don't make it a thing." Margaret looked at me, and the thing that broke something loose in my chest was not that she looked sorry for herself. She looked sorry for me. "I'll call you later," Margaret said. She hung up before Jade could answer. The kitchen held a specific kind of silence. I pushed my chair back. "I should go." Margaret stood too. "Owen, it's fine." "It isn't." She came around the table, not too close, not reaching. "That's not how I see you," she said. I looked at her. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. "You know that, don't you?" I wanted to say yes, immediately, with confidence, and I couldn't, because standing in that kitchen in that particular moment, I wasn't entirely certain how much of the version of me that Jade had rendered had become the version I carried around without noticing. Useful, settled, safe, reliable. Words that were meant to be good until they were used as furniture to walk past. Margaret read my silence with the precision she brought to everything. Her expression shifted, not pity, something more careful than pity. She said softly, "She called you boring because she didn't know what the world looked like when it was worth staying still for." I made a sound that was close to a laugh and wasn't. "Don't say things like that." "Why?" "Because I might believe you." The moment changed, not loudly, not with announcement. The space between us narrowed in a way that had nothing to do with either of us moving. And in that narrowing, I became aware of the warm light in the kitchen, and the sounds of the evening outside the window, and the fact that Margaret Holt was looking at me with an expression I had, for 3 years, been careful not to fully read. She looked away first. "I shouldn't have said that." "No," I said. "You should have said it a long time ago." Her eyes returned to mine. There were a dozen reasons not to hold her gaze. Her daughter, the history, the shape this would take in the world if it became anything other than what it currently was. I knew every one of them. I held it anyway. Because for the first time in close to a year, I felt like I was being seen without being measured, and found to be something other than sufficient. I told her the board still needed a second coat of stain, and that I would come back Saturday. The words came out before I had authorized them. She looked at the fence, then at me. "That would help," she said. It was the safest answer. It was also not the entire answer, and we both knew it. Saturday was different from Thursday. The soft strangeness of the first afternoon had crystallized into something sharper, an awareness that we had both spent 2 days thinking about the same hour in the kitchen, and were now approaching it from opposite sides of a line neither of us had named. I arrived to find her kneeling in the flower bed with a basket of weeding and a wide-brimmed straw hat, and when she heard my truck, she looked up, and for half a second her face did something unguarded and entirely real before she remembered to be careful. Then she stood and brushed the dirt from her jeans. "You came," she said. "I said I would." People say things. Some of them do. That made her smile, briefly, before she let it go. I mixed the stain and started on the replacement board while she moved through the garden, cutting back the roses that had broken in the storm. We found reasons to talk every few minutes. She asked about the craftsman restoration. I asked about the garden. She told me her hydrangeas were dramatic and unforgiving. I said that sounded familiar. She laughed and then tried not to. It went that way for most of the morning, laughter retreating just before it became too easy, conversation moving forward then pulling back, both of us circling something we hadn't agreed to name. Then she came close to hand me a clean rag, and the wind shifted the brim of her hat, and I reached without thinking. Not a decision, just a reflex, and caught it before it went. My hand touched her hair, barely, the lightest possible contact. She went still. I went still. Her eyes came up to mine, and in the first full second of it, the yard disappeared. There was no fence, no stain, no old history attached to the address. There was only her, standing close enough that I could see the faint green in her brown eyes, and the specific texture of the stillness between us, and the realization moving through me that I had not felt this awake in a very long time. She stepped back. "Thank you," she said. "For the hat? For not pretending nothing happened." I set the rag down slowly. "I'm not sure what happened." "Yes, you are." The honesty in that response was almost severe. I turned back to the fence, because wood and stain were considerably safer than Margaret Holt with the morning sun on her face, and I needed a moment to decide what kind of person I was going to be about this. We sat on the porch with coffee when the last board was finished. 2 old chairs angled toward the yard, close enough for easy conversation, far enough to look, from the street, entirely ordinary. Ordinary. The word had started to feel like something I've been hiding behind. Margaret held her mug in both hands. Jade called me again, she said. I figured. She thinks I'm being foolish. I looked at her. For hiring me? For inviting you back. The porch went quiet. She stared at her coffee. She said people will talk. They might, I leaned back. So don't tell them anything true. She glanced at me quickly. I heard how that sounded one beat after I said it. I didn't mean, I know what you meant, she said. She looked down again. Still. I know, I said. I'm not sure I was entirely joking, actually. Her expression softened, but it held sadness. Owen, I need to say something clearly before it becomes something we're carrying inside the wrong container. I set my mug on the railing. She took a slow breath. The afternoon had gone very still. I was fond of you when you were with Jade, she said. Her voice was careful and direct. But not the way I let myself look at now. You were kind to my daughter. You were good in my house. You fixed things without making people feel helpless for having broken them. And I noticed that because I was her mother. And because I'm a person who notices. She paused. After you two ended, I missed you. I told myself I missed the help, or the company, or the way the house felt less empty when someone reliable was in it. Then I stopped lying to myself about which part I actually missed. I didn't move. She looked up at me. But I won't be the foolish woman who chases her daughter's former partner because she's lonely. That's not what this is. You need to be sure. I am. Owen. She stood up, and something in the directness of her shifted. She wasn't building a wall. She was showing me what was behind the one she'd been maintaining. You need to be sure because if this is only about being seen after Jade made you invisible, then I am not what you want. I'm just the first person who handed back the part of yourself she made you ashamed of. I looked at her for a long time. At the woman who had remembered my coffee order for 3 years without ever making a production of it. At the person who had stood in her own yard an hour ago and refused to let her daughter make care into something shameful. At the face that was entirely steady, even while something behind it was anything but. It started before Saturday, I said. Her breath caught. I don't mean when I was with Jade. I would never have let myself see it then, and I don't think you would have either. No, she said quietly, I wouldn't. But after I kept thinking about this house, your coffee, the way being quiet around you never felt like failing at something. I told myself I missed having somewhere to be useful. But that wasn't all of it. Her eyes were bright, but she didn't look away. I want to be around you, I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended. Not because Jade left. Not because I need someone to confirm I'm worth keeping. Because when I'm with you, I don't have to perform a louder version of myself to justify my own existence. That broke her composure, the faintest amount. One tear moved down her cheek before she could stop it. I took one step closer, slowly enough that she could have stepped back. She didn't. We shouldn't rush this, she said. No. People will have things to say. Yes. Jade will. I know. For a while. Possibly longer. Her mouth almost curved. You're not helping. I'm trying not to lie. That did it. She laughed through the tears, a real laugh, the kind that moved through her whole chest, and the sound of it went directly through me. Then her hand came up, not to touch me, not yet, and hovered near my chest, the way a question hovers before it's asked. I covered it with mine. The contact was simple and decisive. Margaret looked at our hands. This is a line, she said quietly. I know. If we cross it, we do it honestly. No hiding. No making it ugly. No pretending the situation is simple when it isn't. I don't want to be someone's rebellion. You're not. And I won't be patient forever. I'm not asking you to be. She looked up at me. Then what are you asking? I'm asking you to let me be worth the difficulty, I said. And I'd like to start by taking you to dinner. A real dinner. Not a fence repair transaction or a kitchen table with history attached to the chairs. Just you and me in a restaurant, trying to be people who chose each other on purpose. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't entirely name. It was partly the look of someone who had been waiting, and partly the look of someone who had not allowed herself to know she was waiting. That's a reasonable ask, she said. High praise. Don't push it, Calloway. But her hand had turned under mine, and her fingers were now holding rather than being held. And that small reversal meant more than either of us said anything about. I left without kissing her. It was the right thing to do, and I was honest enough with myself to admit that it cost me something. At my truck, my phone buzzed. A message from Margaret. Thank you for not making me choose between wanting something and being allowed to want it with my eyes open. I read it standing by the truck, in the last of the afternoon light. Then a second message arrived, after a pause long enough to mean she had typed and deleted something else first. Though for the record, Owen, I very much wanted you to kiss me. I looked up at the house. She was standing at the kitchen window, one hand on the curtain, watching me with a face that held fear and warmth and a honesty that neither of us could have pretended had only started that afternoon. I didn't go back inside. Not that day. Instead, I typed, I know. And then, after a moment, that's exactly why I didn't. Her hand came up to her mouth. I got in the truck before I could become less decent than she believed me to be, and I drove home with the windows down, and it was the first time in 9 months that going home felt like going towards something rather than away from it. For 2 weeks, we existed in the space between the fence and whatever came next. A few messages, practical things mostly. The second coat of stain had cured evenly. The gate latch was holding. A screw she'd found in the flower bed turned out to be the missing piece from the post hardware. The texts had the surface temperature of contractor updates and entire rooms of something else living underneath every word. Jade texted me 3 times. The first was anger, clean and immediate. I can't believe you're doing this. The second came the following morning, after she'd had time to think. Is this actually about my mom, or are you just trying to make me feel bad? To that one, I wrote back, this has nothing to do with punishing you. She didn't respond for 2 days. The third message was different in texture from the first 2, quieter, less certain of its own position. I don't know what to do with this. I sat with that one for a long time, on my back step in the evening with my work boots still on and a plate of reheated leftovers balanced beside me. Then I wrote, you don't have to do anything today, but you don't get to make your mom ashamed of being seen. She didn't answer. Some silences are answers. Margaret called me on a Thursday evening. I was on my porch steps, boots dusty, watching the last of the light go. Hey, she said. Hey. A pause. Then she laughed softly. We sound ridiculous. A little. Only a little? I'm being generous. The tension released by degrees. I heard her breathing even out on the other end. I talked to Jade, she said. How was it? Hard. Yeah. She was angry, then embarrassed, then angry again because the embarrassment had nowhere to go. Margaret was quiet for a moment. But we talked. Not about you mostly, about her. That surprised me. About the fact that she's been running toward things she doesn't actually want because she's afraid that the things she does want might require her to slow down and risk being known by them. We talked about her father, a little. About the pattern of it. She paused. I told her I loved her, and that it would never change. And I told her she didn't get to treat people as property after deciding to set them down. That must have been difficult. It was necessary. Her voice softened. She said you were always the easiest person to leave because you never made her feel guilty for going. She meant it as an insult to you. By the end of the conversation, she understood it differently. I was quiet for a moment. Outside, the street was doing its evening things. A dog, a passing car, the particular settling sound of a neighborhood preparing for night. "How are you?" I asked. "Complicated," she said, "but better for having said the true things. That tends to be how it works. Spoken like a man who has had some practice." "A recent apprenticeship," I said. She laughed. "Saturday?" "Saturday," I said. She came to the coffee shop before me, which I hadn't expected, and was sitting at a corner table by the window in a gray-green dress and a light jacket, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked up when I came in, and the expression on her face was the one she had when she forgot, briefly, to be careful. And in it I could see both how much she wanted this and how seriously she was taking the wanting. I sat across from her. No fence, no porch, no gate with a history attached. No daughter about to walk through it, just the two of us in a room of strangers, trying to be people who had chosen to be there. For a few minutes we were, neither of us would have denied, somewhat careful with each other. The formality that arrives when a relationship that has existed in one form has to recalibrate itself for a different one. We were used to talking across her kitchen table, used to the context of her house and the work I was doing on it, used to conversations that had the comfortable structure of a shared practical situation. Here, there was nothing practical. There was just the table between us and the question of what we were when stripped of the usual scaffolding. I found, after a few minutes, that the answer was still quite natural, actually. Still the same ease that had been the most disarming thing about her from the beginning. She asked about a project I'd been working on, genuinely, in the way she asked about things, with actual curiosity rather than social obligation. And I told her more than I usually would, and she asked questions that proved she had been listening the first time. "I need to know something first," she said, when we'd been there long enough for the coffee to arrive. "All right? If this is because I made you feel seen after Jade made you invisible, if that's the engine of it, then tell me now." I held her gaze. "I've thought about that," I said, carefully. "And? Being seen is part of why I noticed you, but it's not why I want to keep looking." Her expression shifted, the way a tide shifts, the same water, a different angle. I continued because she had earned the full answer. "I like how quiet it is when we're together. Not empty quiet, honest quiet. I like that you remember things without using them as evidence of anything. I like that you don't mistake steady for stupid." I let a corner of my mouth move. "And I like your coffee better than your daughter's, which I realize is a petty thing to say, but it turns out I'm a petty man in small ways." She looked down, smiling despite herself. Was that the deciding factor? Demonstrably. We took it slowly, painfully, deliberately slowly, not because we were hiding, but because we both knew what was at stake, and neither of us had any interest in wasting what we'd managed to build by moving at a pace designed to satisfy impatience. Jade needed time. Margaret gave it to her, without asking me to disappear in the process. That mattered more than it might sound. I learned something about love during those months, watching Margaret be a mother and a woman at the same time, refusing to perform surgery on herself, cutting out the parts someone else found inconvenient, just to make another person more comfortable. A month after the coffee shop, Jade agreed to meet me, a bench in a park near the river. The two of us at what felt like exactly the right emotional distance. Close enough to be honest, far enough to be safe. She stared at the water for a while before she spoke. "I was cruel to you," she said finally. "I called you boring because I was afraid of becoming ordinary. And you were the easiest person to blame because you never once made me feel guilty for leaving." That was more honesty than I had expected, and I took a moment with it before I answered. "Thank you for saying that." She nodded, swallowing hard. Then she added, "I still hate this." "I know. But I don't think she's lonely in the way I was making it." "No," I said. "She isn't." Jade laughed once, briefly, with some real thing in it. She looks different. I didn't answer. Not because it wasn't true, but because I knew what it cost her to say it. 6 months after the fence, Margaret and I went to a small outdoor concert at a park 3 neighborhoods over. It was one of those late spring evenings that feels like a reward after a long winter. Warm without effort. The kind of air that makes people spread blankets on grass and talk to strangers and stay longer than they planned. We had arrived separately, a habit we had kept for a while, and found each other near the back of the crowd. She was wearing a navy jacket and holding a paper cup of something warm, and when she saw me across the lawn, her face did the thing it did in unguarded moments, the thing she no longer bothered to school away before I could see it. We stood close while the band played, an eclectic, moderately talented group who had been performing at this park every spring for longer than either of us had lived in the neighborhood. At some point, without decision or ceremony, her fingers found mine. Not a statement, not a declaration, just her hand moving to mine in the way that hands move toward warmth, and mine closing around hers the same way. Neither of us said anything about it. When 2 people across the lawn looked over, a couple I recognized as neighbors of Margaret's, people who had certainly mentioned it to others, neither of us let go. We stood there under the string lights with the music moving around us, holding on, and it was the smallest possible gesture, and it was the size of something enormous. After years of being told that steady was the same as stagnant, there was something particular about standing still on purpose, holding the hand of someone who was choosing to stand still with you. A year after the fence, I moved into a small house 5 minutes from hers. Not with her, near her. It was our agreement with the timeline, a compromise with the pace of things, and it suited us both in the way that things suit people when they've been arrived at honestly rather than assumed. I fixed the porch on the new house. She planted lavender along the steps and stated firmly that it wasn't symbolic. I let her have that one. Jade came for dinner, eventually. The first time was strained in the particular way of people who care about each other and have not yet worked out the new geometry. The second time was easier. The third time, Margaret burned the bread, genuinely, thoroughly, filling the kitchen with smoke, and I opened every window and Jade laughed so hard she had to sit down, and in the middle of it, Margaret caught my eye across the kitchen, and there it was. The confirmation that we could survive the odd shape of our life. Not in spite of its complications, but with them, honestly, the way you live in a house that has history in the walls and good bones underneath. 2 years after the fence came down, I proposed in the backyard, beside the gate, on a warm evening in late September. The replacement board I had installed was still slightly lighter than the rest of the fence, a slightly different grain, impossible not to notice once you knew where to look. Margaret touched it after I asked, running her fingers along the pale wood with a particular expression. "That fence caused a great deal of trouble," she said. "No," I said. "It told the truth." She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said yes. Not quickly, not casually the way people say yes to things that don't cost them anything. She said it the way a person says something they have understood completely and have chosen anyway, with all its weight and all its worth. When people asked later how we came to be, Margaret would say, "He fixed my fence." I would say, "She made dinner." Both were true. Neither was all of it. All of it was this. Jade looked at the world and called it boring. Margaret looked at the same world and made room for it at her kitchen table. And I finally stopped believing that being reliable was the same thing as being easy to leave. Sometimes the person who truly sees you is not the person you arrived at first. Sometimes love begins with a broken gate, an honest meal, and someone brave enough to say, without apology, "Stay a little longer." Sometimes that is more than enough to build something on. Sometimes it is the entire foundation.